and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and if you see an animated face, it's because I'm talking about a subject that I find very provocative, and that is our Montauk coastline and the town. And with me today, I have one of the great spokesmen of Montauk, Jeremy Samuelson of Concerned Citizens of Montauk.
Thank you.
Who is, by the way, a product of the military-industrial complex we just decided.
That and Catholic school, so.
Oh, God. Oh, that'll do you in.
All right. Well, for the record, they politely asked me to leave at the end of 11th grade, so that was...
I ran away.
Yeah, oh, there you go. All right.
And I was only 6.
Right, oh, well, you figured it out a lot sooner than I did. Yeah.
So anyway, Jeremy, we are very, very bewildered about what's going to happen to our Montauk, because we are all citizens of Montauk and East Hampton. And it's important to us, and not only from the thing that they call the economics, but it's really the social conscience of the people who are living there. So tell us all about what's happening.
Yeah, well, you know, Montauk is the world in a way. I mean, things are changing, and we have to very quickly acknowledge that they're changing, and then if we're smart, what I hope we'll do is make some decisions about how we want to react to that change. So we know Montauk is a perfect example of the coastline eroding, and we know that sea level is rising, and we know that the water table beneath our feet is rising. So when you put those things together and then you zoom out a little further and you say, we're going to have more storms and they're going to be more powerful, it gives you a lot to think about. And the general, I guess, notion that I would offer folks is we're better off if we have a plan and we know what we're going to do before these things become acute crises, how we're going to pay for them, and then, God forbid, we do get hit with a big storm, which is inevitable. You know, what are we going to do differently when we have the opportunity to move some of our infrastructure around? You know, it's a lot of these conversations, I think, move too quickly past the idea that, you know, these are people's livelihoods. You know, these are people's lifelong investments. These are people's jobs, and we have to balance.
And these are people's lives.
Exactly, exactly. You know, so we have to acknowledge the human element here, and as we try to protect the natural resources like the beach and the wetlands and the bluffs and all the things that protect us, that's really what those things do. They protect us from waves and storms and flood inundation. You know, when we look at these things and put all the pieces together, I think there's a couple of conclusions that we come to pretty quickly. The first one is we need to adjust what we're doing. The second one is we've got to get out of the way, and we've got to figure out how to pay for some of these changes. So there's good news too, and the good news, as I would describe it, is we don't have to set the bar, you know, at perfect. You know, we're allowed to take smaller bites of this problem and to try to address the component pieces of it. It would be really daunting to say, okay, there's a lot of conflicting ideas and information and, you know, get overwhelmed. It would be very easy to allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of these challenges. But if we set the bar somewhere short of perfect and say, you know what, can we solve 2 or 3 of these at least 50%? You know, what if in the next 20 years we bought ourselves another 20 years? You know, so not to, you know, sort of play word games, but, you know, what if we took the next 20 years and we said, we really want to have a beach and we want to preserve economic infrastructure. And if we try to do both of those things at the same time, let's solve the problem for 20 years. Let's not solve the problem for 80 years or for 150 years, because that gets overwhelming. There's so much we don't know. You know, is the sea level going to rise, you know, by 1.5 feet by 2050, or is it going to rise by 3 feet by 2050? Those are both numbers that are contained in reports from New York State, but the state tells us they don't know. they're pointing to a range. And so I think we should allow ourselves that same level of imprecision and say, you know what, let's do some good that is based on sound science, but let's not hold ourselves to the standard of trying to get it exactly perfect the first time out of the gate. Because my personal belief is we're going to paralyze ourselves and probably not do anything that really helps us if we take all of that burden on at once.
That's a very good point, because the truth of the matter is we really don't know.
Right.
I mean, what if, are you listening, God? What if people do get together and climate change is slowed through the actions of human beings who are causing, all of this to happen?
Yeah.
And maybe there will be a chance for us not to have it quite as bad as I see it. I mean, I see it as unbelievable,
I think there's sort of a more sophisticated worldview that a lot of us are trying to catch up to. And what I mean by that is, I don't know that we have to solve climate change or sea level rise. Those don't strike me as ideas that can be solved or concepts that have to be solved. I think they're issues that we have to adapt to. So let's take the burden off of ourselves of saying we have to fix this thing and say we're going to have to live with this thing. And when you shift that mindset and you say, okay, we still want to live in Montauk, we still want to have a gorgeous beach, we still want to have a resort-based economy. Those are the givens. If we're talking about adapting to a world that's changing rather than trying to fix the world that's changing, the world has never been a constant. For those of us who believe in science, evolution. I was reading with my son last night. We got into a book that I don't think either one of us really understood. It was a bunch of big words about dinosaurs, and I kept mispronouncing things. But I just kept having this thought that the world will do something with itself. The world will be just fine. A million years from now, a billion years from now, unless we figure out how to completely break this thing, there's going to be a planet, and it's going to be circling the sun, and there's going to be something living here. The question is, are we going to still be here ourselves? Are we going to adapt to the world as it's changing? So the Earth's going to be fine, but are we going to be okay? And are we going to treat the world in a way that it will allow us to continue to live here? Are we going to adapt to the changing world around us? So not to make it too esoteric. I mean, I hope we are going to have a conversation about Montauk, but are we going to adapt to the rising sea level? Are we going to acknowledge that the shoreline is eroding? And are we going to insist on trying to fix that? Or are we going to acknowledge that that's a fundamental truth and we're probably better off, rather than boxing with it, doing jujitsu, taking that energy that's coming at us and putting it into a solution rather than trying to stand up and oppose it. You can't oppose the ocean. People have tried that. We've tried that in Montauk fairly recently, and guess what? We got exactly what we thought we would get, which is erosion and exposed sandbags. Okay. Why did we get that? Why was that the better solution? Because we really had two options on the table. One was a stone wall, and the other one was sandbags. And many of us, myself included, fought like crazy for 2 years to get the stone wall to go away. And so the lesser of two evils was the sandbags. Did anybody love it? No. Was it perfect? No. Does it work? No. Beats the pants off a stone wall.
You bet.
So now we're trying to fix what's wrong with having these sandbags in the beach. So we spend a lot of time at the shop I work for called Concerned Citizens of Montauk. We spend a lot of time working on coastal policy and trying to find this adaptation that's going to allow us to hopefully live in a way where we've got that economic activity and a beach. And there's not easy answers. Spoiler alert, there's no easy answers here. Yeah. But when you try to find a way forward, you have to acknowledge that we're probably going to do some things in the next 20 years that don't solve the problem forever. They buy us a little bit of time. They give us the room to peel back from the beach a little bit, relocate some of that infrastructure. There's this notion sometimes that the easiest thing to do is to simply say no. What if we just said no and we just didn't do anything on the shoreline? We didn't put sand on the beach. We didn't have sandbags that went in to protect some infrastructure. What if we just said no? And sadly, that's not really an answer either, because what happens if you say no? Well, I'll tell you exactly what would have happened in Montauk. What would have happened is the property owners who have rights. I mean, that frustrates a lot of people, but the Constitution gives them rights. They have rights. And so, what happens if we just say no to everything is those folks go to a judge and they get emergency permission to put in private rock in front of their hotels, and that doesn't work. So we've got to be smarter than the problem, and we've got to work with the property owners, and we've got to honor the environmental interest, but find a way where we're actually blending some of the solutions here so that we can have a 20-year solution that gives us time to exit these folks from the very vulnerable position that they're in, exit them from the beach in a way that doesn't either collapse the economy or take away the beach in the meantime. And I don't mean to sound like I think I've got it all figured out, because I absolutely don't. But I think there's a couple of priorities here that we have to make sure we're balancing at the same time. We desperately need to have a beach for Montauk, because that's Montauk. That's the definition of Montauk.
The definition of this whole place, I always said the name of this place is called beach.
Right.
I was in the water this morning, ice cold water, I
Good
can tell you that. But that's what I'm here for. I'm here to swim. Right. And and then when I stop swimming here, I swim in Gurney's in Montauk. So I mean, it's one place or another that I'm going to be swimming, and that's the name of this place. It is beach. You're absolutely right. Tell us a little bit about what the Army Corps of Engineers is proposing.
Yeah. So I think, as you know, they came out 10 days ago, something like that, 2 weeks ago, and they had a meeting where they said, okay, we've been working on this Fire Island to Montauk Point thing for 60 years, and we're finally ready to tell you what.
I know, I was a mere slip of a girl when I first heard of it.
Right, exactly. So, literally, I mean, the punchline, and I know you've heard this, but people have started their careers with the Army Corps and finished them for 3 generations now. You got to do 20. I'm an Army brat. I know. You got to do 20, and then you've earned your pension, and you can retire. 3 generations of retirees have gone through the Corps working on this project. That's insane. But okay, here we are. 60 years later, we now own the document that they called the General Reevaluation Report. And what that spelled out was they wanted to, in front of the sandbag project that's there, they wanted to bring in 120,000 cubic yards of sand. Now, what does that really mean? I mean, it's just a number for a lot of, sure. Unless you drive a truck that, you're delivering sand, it's probably just a number. So if you've been down to the beach there and you look at the sandbag project that was put in place, 120,000 cubic yards is ballpark plus or minus what was inside the bags that's there now. So if you're just looking for something to relate it to, it's not exact, but it's pretty close to what's inside those bags. So if you're thinking, okay, 60 years later, what is the Corps proposing? They're proposing every 4 years to come in and put roughly an equivalent amount of sand that's inside those sandbags in front of the sandbags. That's not enough sand. All that does is maintain the status quo. It doesn't give you a big sandy beach, and it doesn't keep the sandbags covered, and it doesn't really protect the infrastructure that's behind it. So out of the goals that you've got, you're not accomplishing any of them. All it does is maintain the current status quo, which is not a good status quo for us. So what
maintains the status quo until the next nor'easter.
Exactly. And so the proposal from the Corps was to do this 120,000 cubic yards and to do it at a projected interval of every 4 years. Well, that's pretty laughable. That's not going to work. So what the town did in response to that, knowing that that was going to be the recommendation that came forward, the town went and worked with a set of contractors who do these designs and all of that, and they said, okay, how do we actually get a beach and preserve this economic infrastructure long enough for us to come up with a financing plan to relocate this stuff? And the recommendation that came back was that they needed something more like 700,000 cubic yards of sand. Now, just a second ago, we were talking about 120,000. That's just a number for a lot of us. But take that number and expand it by 6 times. Okay, there you go. So that's a lot more sand. The other thing that you have to appreciate here is that the town is now proposing to take that larger volume of sand and spread it over a longer area of the beach. And there's one of these little rules of thumb that the coastal engineering types will tell you. They'll say if you double the length of an area where you spread the sand, you actually quadruple the lifespan of the project. So, You know, if you do more sand, but you just put it in one area,
Yes.
it's not going to last as long as if you spread it out. Okay, so there you go. What the town did was they went out and they asked some engineering types to take a look at what's the volume of sand that's needed. They came up with this 700,000 cubic yard number. The town then took that number and they presented it to the Corps and they said, doesn't something like this make more sense? So the Corps then evaluated that and they said, you know what, okay, we're willing to consider that. We'll work with the town. Let's see if we can drive towards that as a goal rather than the more modest goal of 120,000 cubic yards that we just described. So that's where the conversation is now. The Corps is signaling, and they did this in the meeting they had out in Montauk, the Corps is signaling that they're willing to do this beach that is twice as long and has something like 6 times the volume of sand. And there would still be a renourishment element, which means every 4 years or so they would come and pump sand from offshore, just like this initial construction would be. So, you know, they go out and it's a huge vessel. They did this in Bridgehampton and Sagaponack a couple years ago, over 6 miles of beach. And that beach is actually doing very well right now. So they would take this sand pumping dredge and they would get it up onto the beach, and then there would be excavators and whatnot that would spread it out. I have to tell you, there are pros and cons to this proposal. It is not the cheapest thing in the world, but it's cheaper than doing nothing, that's for sure. And it probably only buys you a certain amount of time. One thing that the Army Corps said very clearly when they came to Montauk was they will be in the sand pumping business for 30 years, and then they're done. So they're signaling very clearly. It's not even a signal, it's an explicit statement on their part. They're saying, look, the world is changing, the sea is rising, storms are getting more frequent, and they're getting more intense. We will help you, if you want to describe it that way, we will help you for 30 years engaging in these contracts for sand pumping projects. But the corollary to that, the follow-on that they get to very quickly is, if you are smart as a community, you will use that time to get yourself out of harm's way. And in my mind, that's the only way this makes any sense. If we are going to do a large-scale beach engineering project like this, and that's all we do, we've failed. We've failed miserably at that point, because we might have a beach for some of that time. We might have some economic infrastructure for some of that time. But what we haven't done is actually set ourselves on a path to have both of those things for a longer period of time, because the clock's going to run out. And 30 years will be here before we know it. And next thing we know, we're not going to have the assistance to continue to pay for these sand pumping projects, assuming that there's even sand out there. And that's one of the issues here. In order for us to go out in the ocean and pump a large volume of sand up onto the beach, they have to do a lot of study. And let's not get ahead of ourselves. Yeah, there's a lot of detailed environmental work that needs to be done to find out exactly where the sand is. There's a pretty decent idea on the part of the Corps now, but where is the sand? Is it the right kind of sand? Is it the right volume of sand? Can we access that site on a regular basis to renourish the beach? So there's a lot of just baseline assessment to see if the sand is even there. They're talking currently about a site that's about 1.5 miles off of Hither Hills, so to the west of the downtown Montauk area. What are the impacts to the substrate, the bottom, the benthic community of, the fish and the complex, life that lives down there now? How much of that are we going to disturb? Is that something that we're willing to, take on as a trade-off? Are we willing to use this resource in a way that's different from how it currently exists? And are we willing to pay for that and use it for 30 years? And then, transition away from that over time because we found a way to get the infrastructure off of the beach. So that's a lot. There's a lot to think about here.
Are you kidding? I can hardly comprehend it all. It is quite a lot. But I have thought about, obviously, since I've been involved in this as a Fire Islander, I know we were talking about that years ago. I mean, it was going to come from way down east of the areas that were populated, and they were going to, actually, we were told they were going to put long pumps that they were going to pump it in, and of course, we all know that it's the literal flow, that it will actually sort of put itself, whether you dump it that way or not, it will all go from east to west anyway,
Right.
But that's what they were talking about. hey, 60 years ago.
Right.
So now it's not being pumped, but it was, again, how do you do it? Now, I will tell you, years ago they were talking about putting a false barrier out there with cars, old junk cars. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Can you imagine the toxicity that they were going to dump into the I mean, there have been so many things that have gone around for so long.
And they actually did that. They took old New York City subway cars, and they cleaned them. Now, what that means, I don't know, because the old New York City subway cars are a pretty rough starting spot. But they cleaned them, whatever that means. And then they dumped them. I think they did some off of the coast of North Carolina, and I think they did some off the coast of New Jersey. It was the same idea. It was a breakwater.
Yes, they did in New Jersey, and I know people who went to that area after it was done, and they say it did get very, very, the beach was incredible after that. So I don't know if that's ever going to be anything. But there is a lot of money available because of Sandy. We have that money. It's just using it the best way and the wisest way.
We have to retreat. I mean, there's no way around that. The question is, in my mind, are we going to accomplish retreat in one big step, or is it more realistic to think of it as smaller steps? So if we set a goal, and this is what I was trying to say earlier, if we set a goal of pick a period of time, within 20 years or 30 years, we want to be exited from our most vulnerable positions on the shoreline. Okay, there's a goal, and if we can get agreement on that goal, then we can start to chop it up and say, okay, what's the first step? What's the first piece we need to take care of? What comes after that? How are we going to pay for it? Do we use some parts of Community Preservation Fund? Are there other funding streams that help us, pay for some of the costs here? That's one of the real tricks. This is going to cost us money. It took us decades to back into this incredibly vulnerable position, and we spent a lot of money doing it. And sadly now, it's not just as simple as, well, we're done with this coastal vulnerability thing, you can have it back, Mother Nature. We're not allowed to just abandon this stuff. We have to exit in a way that, actually, preserves the resource, but also preserves people's property rights. We can't just tell people, I hope you enjoyed using your hotel, because now, you have to shut it down. If you're going to actually surrender that use from somebody, if you're going to take it from them, you have to compensate them for that, which means the checkbook has to come out. So which checkbook are we paying for this out of? Who's on the hook? It's not easy.
No, it is not easy. It is not easy at all. And but I am also very happy that that the Army Corps retreated from the stones, because we have that. And Fire Island, if you go to Ocean Beach and you see next door to it Robin's Rest, you'll see what that groin type of thing does. No good.
Oh, it's bad news. There's no way around it.
I mean, we used to walk there and say, the Army Corps of Engineers did this, ha, 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 as we looked at Robin's Rest that had a shoreline that, had houses up on stilts that, were going to fall in sooner or later. And when you see a house in the shore and the ocean pounding it, you will never forget it as long as you live. It is an incredible sight. And you can't beat the ocean. And I'm also concerned, as you mentioned, about the life that lives in that ocean and how they're going to get this sand. It's a very complex thing. So what's the next step?
Next step is, it just came from a very long meeting over at Town Hall where we were talking about how we're going to roll out the coastal adaptation and resiliency planning process. So I think many of your viewers know that the town has this whole hamlet plan that it's working on. So this is a parallel process to that that's focused exactly on these coastal questions. So just like with the hamlet plan, there's going to be public meetings, there's going to be maps rolled out on the table, there's going to be experts pointing out, look, here's where we're vulnerable. People think it's common sense, but sometimes we're vulnerable in areas we didn't realize we're vulnerable, and sometimes we think something's more vulnerable than it really is, so there's a lot of assessment that's going on in advance of these meetings. The point is, I hope folks will keep their ears open and check their emails, read the papers. There's going to be a series of public meetings coming up starting in about, I think, December and going all the way through about the next year, where they have a chance to really get presented this information, offer their thoughts and observations, and participate in a bunch of public meetings where some decisions are going to get made about, do we go down this road or do we go down that road?
I don't know. I'm assuming that you know some of these people who are in the most vulnerable areas with the motels, and I would imagine also some homes. I've been down in that area, and I do know that there are people who are living around in some of those vulnerable areas. And how do they feel about retreat or relocation, we're going to call it?
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. You know, it's again, this is people's livelihoods. You know, there's, it's so much harder to kind of have a chip on our shoulder and tell people, well, you should just get out of the way, when you actually know the guy. You know, when you know that that was the teacher who bought the house with every penny they had, and you know they raised their kids in it. It's harder. You know, we are a community, and I keep telling folks who who want to just have a harder line, you know, well, just let them fall in the ocean. You say, well, hang on, you know, don't you go down to that hotel and play music and have a drink down there sometimes in the summertime? Yeah, but, you know, I don't want to do that anymore. You say, I saw you there last week. What do you mean? Come on, man. Aren't we a community? You know, shouldn't we be trying to find a way to make sure that everybody has a voice in how we're going to solve this problem? My firm belief is this. If everyone doesn't have a seat at the table for solving this problem, whatever solution we come up with just isn't going to work. I think it's just that easy. Everyone's got to be at the table.
Well, my money is on you, my dear. Thank you so much for coming. And
thank you.
It's
always a pleasure.
Gosh almighty is all I got to say about this problem. Yeah. It's complex. Yeah. It's really complex. Yeah. There are no easy solutions to whatever you're going to term it, whatever title you give it. There are no easy solutions. It's going to be hard, but it's going to take minds like yours and everybody else. So, folks, stay tuned and be a part of helping us think about how to help Montauk and East Hampton. You know, because we're all a part of it.
Thanks for having us. It's great to talk about it. Appreciate it.
Yeah. A couple of other things that I wanted to tell you.